Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Hord-Sterryman monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I will serve as the host for today's program. This presentation will explore how environmental stressors, including heat stress, influence dairy cattle health, productivity, and resilience across generations. The discussion will cover the effects of prenatal heat stress on mammary gland development and future lactation performance. Strategies to mitigate heat stress in young stock will also be talked about, and this includes innovative cooling methods to enhance calf welfare and long-term productivity. If you're listening to the presentation live, you can find a copy of the handouts. Just look at the GoToWebinar control panel and click on the handout section, and down there you'll find a link to the PDF. In addition, if you have any questions for our speaker, please type those into the questions section of the control panel, and we'll answer those following the presentation. Today, we welcome Dr. Jimena Laporta to the webinar. Dr. Laporta is an associate professor of lactation physiology in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Originally from Uruguay, she earned her BS and MS degrees in animal sciences before completing her PhD in dairy science at UW-Madison in 2014. She then spent 4 years as a faculty member at the University of Florida before returning to UW-Madison in 2020. Her research focuses on environmental and nutritional factors and how they shape mammary gland development and lactation performance. She's especially interested in the early life heat stress and exploring how that programming impacts calf physiology and long-term productivity across generations. She has led numerous graduate students and postdoc students and has published many peer-reviewed articles. So we're really excited to have her as our speaker for this Hord-Sterryman webinar. Dr. Laporta, welcome to the webinar, and we look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled Beyond Summer Heat Stress, Understanding Impacts on Dairy Cattle Across Generations.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Abby. I'm gonna get started here. Like you said, I'm gonna be talking about the first part of my presentation on the impact of late gestation heat stress on multiple generations. And then in the second part of this talk, I'm gonna focus mostly on the pregnant heifers and pre-weaned dairy calves. Okay, so I think it's no news to anyone that with climate change, global temperatures are rising. And I think it's important to recognize that heat stress is not a regional issue anymore. It has become a global issue, and it's now affecting highly populated regions that were once considered low risk, such as the Midwest in USA, where I reside, Canada, and some parts of Northern Europe. And despite what I like to refer to as our individual or collective efforts, those predictions are not very promising. I don't want to sound dramatic, but by 2050, in the USA is projected to experience increases in temperature of more than 2 degrees Celsius. And that clearly has an impact on our industry. From the cow side of things, it will continue to reduce milk yield, fertility. It's a welfare concern. And it also, from the crop side, it reduces the yield and quality of feeds. Now, we're all well aware of the effects that heat stress has on lactating cows. And that's primarily because we have well-documented effects on the impact on feed intake, milk production, fertility, and health. Now, most of my research have focused on the non-lactating members of the herd, including dry cows, heifers, and pre-weaned calves, which are not typically a priority for summer heat abatement. But I'm going to show you today how heat stress can program these animals, and these effects are going to see later in life, and they're going to translate into a less productive cow. So summer heat stress is more than just summer. Its effects can extend beyond summertime. All right, so why do we need to focus on the dry pregnant cow? Well, there are multiple effects. There are multiple generation or programming events that are happening in that one single animal, that dry pregnant cow. And that's herself, the cow, that it's undergoing mammary gland involution and redevelopment, regenerating her gland for her next lactation, and she's directly exposed to the heat stress. Now, she's also pregnant, and the fetal daughter is undergoing her last trimester of gestation, so we're going to have these programming effects on her. And one generation that we don't typically talk about is the future granddaughters. And that's because in the fetal ovary of the daughter, the fetal germline is developing in utero, and that fetal germline that will become the oocytes that are going to give rise, obviously after fertilization, to that second generation. So one event of heat stress can have multiple effects in multiple generations. Now, when we think about the cow herself that is directly exposed to heat stress, there are highly coordinated and regulated cellular events in her mammary gland that are derailed by the effect of heat stress. Some of those are happening during early involution, and what heat stress does, it derails those events and it delays involution by reducing cell death early on during that dry period phase and not allowing that mammary gland to redevelop as she approached parturition and with the hormones of pregnancy to proliferate and generate a mammary gland that will produce in her next lactation. So in other words, heat stress in the dry period gets in the way of mammary gland cell turnover and delays involution. And that translates into a mammary gland that will have alterations and carryover effects in her next lactation that will lead to this reduced synthetic capacity in her next lactation. So to show that, what we did is we took mammary biopsies at different stages of lactation after that dry cow was heat stressed during summer. And what we see here is that the mammary gland microstructure of a cow that was heat stressed when she was dry looks a lot different, so that's here in red, looks a lot different to the mammary gland of a cow that had some sort of heat abatement during her dry period. So we can see significant differences in the size and the number of these lobulo-alveolar structures, which are the milking units of the mammary gland. When we count those mammary epithelial cells that make up those alveoli, there are less mammary epithelial cells, and those are the secretory cells of the gland. So overall, this gland will have a less secretory capacity, less synthetic capacity in the next lactation. Now, that will produce a cow mammary tissue that is going to produce less milk in the next lactation. This 6 to 8 week dry period under heat stress has carryover effects that span across 40 weeks in milk. This graph by Dr. Tao in 2013 is showing 40 weeks in milk and the milk production of those cows. And in red, you see that if that cow was under heat stress when she was dry, she produced on average 5 kilos less milk than a cow that was offered heat abatement during the dry period. One thing we need to remember is that these two groups of cows during lactation are managed under the same environment. So what happened in the dry period is driving this difference. And this was not just one study. Dr. Tao didn't get lucky just that year. So here there are 14 different studies showing that across the board in different universities, different countries, different heat abatement methods, if cows are heat stressed during the dry period, they are going to produce between 2 and 5 kilos less milk in their next lactation. So big impact on the cow side of things and cows that are directly exposed to heat stress. Now, the fetus is developing in utero, so the dry period coincides with a portion of the last trimester of gestation, and this is a period of developmental plasticity. So there's a lot of dynamic and highly regulated processes that are happening in utero that are going to lead to that fetal growth growing exponentially. In fact, 70%, 75% of the birth weight of that heifer is going to be acquired during those last 2 months of gestation. So even though the fetus is fully formed at this time, there's a lot of processes happening that are leading to organ maturation and functional organization of those tissues and organ systems. And these cellular processes that are happening in utero are all temperature sensitive, and the fetus is relying on these maternal mechanisms of thermoregulation to thermoregulate. So maternal heat stress is going to lead to fetal hyperthermia, and that's going to lead to programming effects on that calf that will persist even after they are born. So the fetus is trapped inside the cow and is highly dependent on her thermoregulation for regulating her temperature. So what we did is to understand and characterize both short and long-term effects of programming effects of heat stress. In collaboration with Dr. Dahl at the University of Florida, what we did is we used this model of fetal hyperthermia to generate in utero heat stress and in utero cooled heifers that we can then follow throughout their lifetime. So the way we did this is we have a group of dry pregnant cows in freestall barns. They were under hot and dreading humid summer in Florida with THIs of between 75 and 84, but with peaks of 90, 95. And these cows have elevated respiration rate and rectal temperature and give birth to in utero heat stress daughters. And then the other group of cows concurrently, at the same time, they were exposed to the same environmental temperatures and THI, but now they have access to evaporative cooling with fans and water soakers in the feed lanes and fan over the bed stalls. And these allowed those cows to reduce respiration rate, reduce rectal temperature, and gestate that heifer under more thermoneutral conditions. So we generated in utero cool. I put in quote here because we're not technically cooling the fetus. We are just allowing that gestation to undergo under thermoneutral conditions. So what we see is that in utero heat stress triggers adverse effects that manifest later in life postnatally. There's nothing good about heat stress, as my colleague Jeff Dahl likes to say. Now, there are some hallmarks that we see across all these studies that we have performed in Florida. And these are recurrent effects: reduced gestation length, reduced birth weight. That reduced birth weight is also evident at weaning. These heifers are shorter. They have reduced apparent efficiency of absorption. So an effect in the ability to absorb immunoglobulins from colostrum, leading to a less robust immune system. They also eat less milk and less grain. And this growth retardation that we see at birth and at weaning, as you can see in this graph, this is hip height, is not transient, that even after weaning, up to 1 year of life, we see that these heifers are shorter, they are smaller. And so this effect is not transient, it's quite permanent, and I would say, in fact, is lifelong, because you see here we have heifers that we follow from birth until they leave the herd. And in this graph, you can see the effect on survival. So in this axis, you have survival percentage and different lifetime events such as birth, weaning, first AI, first calving, first, second, and third lactation. In red, you have the heat stress daughters, and you see this pattern here of this red line below the black line that represents the cool daughters. So what we notice here is that if they are in utero heat stress, they are going to have a reduced survival to first calving. On average, 11% less of those are going to make it to first calving, and overall reduced productive life of 18% less make it to the first lactation. And overall, we see this reduced lifespan of more than 12 months, which is very significant. Now, this is the milk production in the first, second, and third lactation of these in utero heat stress daughters. And in this graph, we have the first 35 weeks in milk. This is milk yield. And you can see that the first lactation is pretty normal. But we see that the second and third lactation overlap, and we don't want this, right? So the impact of heat stress in those heat stress, in utero heat stress daughters, is not allowing them to express their full potential. And this is more evident when we compare it to the first and second and third lactation of in utero heat stress daughters. As you can see here, those are going to be making a lot more milk in all of those 3 lactations. So you see more milk in the first lactation, more milk in the second lactation, and more milk in the third lactation. So in utero heat stress is leading to these heifers that are less productive cows with a shorter lifespan. So the effects on survival and the effects on production are very prominent. Now, a question that we have been chasing for quite a while now is, how is this possible that these effects manifest 2, 3, or 4 years down the road? And how is this happening mechanistically? So we hypothesized that in utero heat stress is going to trigger these cellular and molecular changes in several organs and tissues in these in utero heat stress heifers that are going to impact their development and viability and have these consequences in survival and productivity that I show you early on. So what we did is these emerging, we have a few studies showing that there are effects in the epigenetic programming of these animals that are hardwiring the identity of cells and organs. And without getting too much into the weeds of this, these epigenetic changes can be heritable, and those can survive cell division, and that's how it can affect the offspring for a long time. So all of these tissues and organ systems are impacted by in utero heat stress, but one we are mostly more particularly interested in is the mammary gland, because its role in lactation and milk production. So typically when we think about the mammary gland, we often think about how to influence its synthetic capacity during lactation, or perhaps during this peripubertal and even in the gestational phase, but always more in mature cows. Another way to approach this is to look at earlier times in development, because we can influence the developmental trajectory of the mammary gland starting even before she's born. Okay, so I refer to this as the perinatal period, 60 days before they are born to 90 days after they are born. So there's a lot of research showing that we can influence mammary gland developmental trajectory by nutritional management, because the mammary gland is plastic at this stage in life. So we can influence this from an early life point. So we have shown that even the parenchyma tissue that is going to become the secretory tissue in a mature cow increased by 25-fold during this time from birth to weaning, when the body weight only increases 1.5 to 2-fold depending on how you manage. So even though to the naked eye the mammary gland is not growing a whole lot, internally those tissues are indeed growing exponentially. So we can, by managing nutrition and the environment, we can manipulate and we can affect positively the mammary gland production, and that can lead to cows being more productive. So this is what we address during this project. Here we have our one of our USDA grants with Dr. Dallas at COPI in Florida, where we generated in utero heat stress and in utero cool heifers, and we euthanized them at different time points in life, in here birth and weaning. And what we see is that in utero heat stress heifers have smaller udders. So we dissect those udders and we look at the fat pad mass and the parenchyma mass, and we also see that those are lighter if they were in utero heat stress. When we look at the parenchyma tissue more closely, what we see both at birth and at weaning is that they have underdeveloped ductal structures. At this point in life, we see mostly epithelial ductal structures, and we see fewer branching morphogenesis going on. You see less, this is at weaning, you see less secondary and tertiary ducts growing. And another important thing that we see is 30% fewer cells proliferating. So this is happening during the first 60 days of life. Now we follow a group of heifers until puberty, we synchronize them, and when we measure estrogen production, we see that they have lower circulating estrogen. And we all know how important estrogen is in around the time of puberty. So here, these heifers are about 12 months of age. And when we take a mammary biopsy from these heifers, at about 12 months of age, we see that they have lower expression of estrogen receptors. So they are less sensitive to that estrogen that is lower in their circulation. And that's leading to a 40% reduction in their proliferation of the mammary epithelial cells at this time. So that those glands are growing less quickly. Now, a group of cows, we follow them until their first lactation, and we take biopsies at different time points in that lactation. But what we see overall is that even 2 years, 2 or more years down the road, in utero heat stress, it's going to have compromised lobular alveolar development in these cows. And so we see fewer and smaller alveoli. Remember that these are the milk secretory units. We see fewer mammary epithelial cells. Those are the cells that are making milk. And we see higher percentage of connective tissue here. You can see that in blue, where at this point in lactation, we really want to maximize the secretory tissue and not the connective tissue. But we see higher proportion of blue here. And then once more, we see this in at birth, at weaning, at puberty, and once more we see less proliferating cells in the mammary gland of a lactating cow that was under heat stress in utero. So a few things that we learned from this study are that early life mammary gland development really matters, and it helps to set the foundation for how much secretory tissue can really develop during pregnancy and also during lactation. And that stressors, in this case, in utero heat stress, during these sensitive lifetime developmental windows can really limit the milk synthesis capacity of this gland and really reduce epithelial cell proliferation, which is very important in a growing tissue. All right, here. So the connection, we talk about the mom, we talk about the daughter, and now we're going to talk about the granddaughter. So the connection between the mother, the daughter, and the granddaughter is going to begin in utero, and it's going to be via the germline, as we talked about earlier today. Let me grab my pointer here. So when a pregnant cow is carrying a female fetus, that fetus is going to be developing the oocytes or the egg cells in her fetal ovaries, as you can see in this photo. So the F1 daughter is going to be born with a lifetime supply of eggs or oocytes, which will be her ovarian reserve, and that will give rise to the granddaughters of this dry cow. So what we wanted to look at here, we wanted to test whether in utero hyperthermia of the F1 female daughter can modulate the developing germline and affect the growth, survival, and productive capacity of that second generation because of this exposure in utero. And we were in the right direction. So this is a study that we did looking at retrospective analysis of lifetime records from several studies at the University of Florida. So the same concept as I show you with the daughters, this is the survival rate. And these are the different lifetime events. Now looking at the granddaughter of a heat stress or cold dry cow. So what we see here is the same pattern or a similar pattern where the red line representing those granddaughters, it's below the black line for the entire time. So we start to see these early life losses and reduced productive life, and even 40% of those F2 animals now leaving even before first lactation. So we wanted to get a closer look at this, and what we did here is we track the granddaughters of either cool dry cows or heat stressed dry cows, and this is like 3-4 years down the road from birth to weaning. And so we look at things like feed intake, IgG levels, we see the growth trajectory, the mammary phenotypic characteristics, and we see that they look identical, they are similar throughout this pre-weaning phase. So if we're making decisions on what heifers to keep based on these characteristics, they look identical, so we'll probably keep them all. But because we were kind of curious to see what else was going on in the mammary gland, we did mammary gland ultrasounds to visualize the cross-sectional area of the parenchyma and the fat pad tissues. And you can see here, this is a granddaughter of a cool dry cow. This is her parenchyma cross-sectional area, and this is her fat pad. But when we look at the granddaughters of a heat-stressed dry cow, you see the significant reduction in the parenchyma tissue, cross-sectional tissue, and also the smaller fat pad that they have. This is at 2 months of age. So we went a step further, and we took a mammary biopsies of these animals to look at the microstructure of the tissue and the cellular turnover. And what we see here is that if they are granddaughters of a heat-stressed dry cows, they have smaller epithelial ductal structures, as you can see here highlighted, and they also have fewer proliferating cells. So once more, as we saw on the F1, reduced proliferation at different lifetime points. Here again, we see fewer cell proliferating, more cells dying. So this alter cellular turnover, which in a growing tissue, we want to have more cells proliferating and less cells dying. And we also see lower expression of the ER alpha receptor. So all of these are what I like to call unfavorable characteristics from an early life developing mammary gland. And as you can expect, they are going to lead to cows that are going to produce less milk in the next lactation. So these granddaughters of heat-stressed dry cows produce on average 1.5 kilos less milk in their first lactation. So remember, this is 4 or 5 years down the road from that original exposure of their grandmothers, okay? So if we kept these heifers and now they are producing less milk, it might be a little too late to fix the problem. So this is why the second generation is so important to understand and to try to figure out how we can revert this. So to summarize this first part of the webinar, I think one of the things that our research highlights is this critical shift in perspective that we have to have when we think about late gestation heat stress. It's a multi-generational issue that affects not only the cow herself that is directly exposed, it affects her daughter and it affects her granddaughter through the germline. So the effects that we're seeing on summer period where dry pregnant cows are exposed to heat stress expands beyond that summer because of these multi-generational effects on the daughters and the granddaughters. So what about growing pregnant heifers? These growing pregnant heifers are not immune to heat stress effects, despite that they are not actively producing milk or they don't have a dry period per se. But there are a few things that make them more susceptible to heat stress. One of those is that they are still growing, and presumably they have smaller body size and they are less effective in dissipating heat. And they are also supporting fetal growth. As I show you, it's happening in an exponential rate at this late gestation time points. They're also growing their mammary glands. Gestation is the period of greatest alveolar development in the mammary gland, especially during these last 2 months of gestation, and that's mostly driven by estrogen, progesterone, prolactin. And these growing heifers are typically housed on pasture with limited access to shade. And as we know, cooling cows on pasture can be a little bit more challenging than compared to barns, although not impossible. We can have trees, shade cloth, and also overhead sprinklers as we irrigate the pastures. And there are some research showing how we can do this. Now, this is the environment that they would be exposed to when they are raised on pasture. This is in Florida. In this graph, we can see in a span of 3 months in a Florida summer. This is the black hobo temperature on pasture. And what we see is that during summer, we have peaks that are above 122 degrees Celsius or 30, here we have the 35 degrees Celsius mark. And what we see is that if we move them to a barn, we see what I like to call the power of shade, because we don't see those peaks anymore. We're avoiding that solar radiation, and we can lower that solar radiation to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and respiration rates that on pasture were 100 breaths per minute to 65 breaths per minute now. So shade is pretty powerful. Now, when we put these heifers, this is exactly what we did in this project. We put these heifers inside barns, and when you do that, you see some very interesting things. I like to compare this to when you check into a 5-star hotel or an all-inclusive. You start to see these, you know, you jump on your bed, you check all the amenities, you're very excited. So these heifers are learning what to do, and as you can see, it's pretty funny to see how they check their amenities. Now, this is what we did again in this study. So what we see here is that we can reduce those 100 breaths per minute that those cows on pasture were having to 65 when we put them in barns, just with the effect of shade, and even farther to 43 when we give them soakers and fans. So we see this consistent reduction in respiration rate as the heifer approaches calving. You can see on average it's a 22 reduction in breaths per minute across all those weeks. Now we also see, as you know, cows are not very efficient sweaters, and they use more respiration for dissipating heat. But what we're doing when we provide these fans and soakers, we're helping them to remove that heat from the skin through evaporation. So you can see here the weeks prior to calving, from -8 to -1, we're able to reduce sweating rate by 2-fold. So we are allowing them to release that heat from the skin without having to rely on their own sweat. And when we did this throughout the day, we see as well that throughout the day, those heifers that we provide fans and soakers to promote evaporative cooling, they have lower sweating rates. So we're helping them out to thermoregulate. So cooling heifers during the last 60 days of gestation, even though they don't have a dry period, it's a win-win. From the cow side, we see improvements in milk yield in the next lactation. They produce 3.9 kilos more per day. We see improvements in fat yield and also in protein yield in those first lactation heifers, so we can influence that first lactation by cooling them for the last 60 days of gestation. And we also see effects on her offspring, presumably through fetal programming effects, as I show you in those F1s from multiparous cows. So we are able to extend their gestation for a few days. We also observe increase in immunoglobulins absorption, so that apparent efficiency of absorption increases up to 16%, and also the circulating levels of immunoglobulins by 10 milligrams per deciliter throughout the pre-weaning phase. And also we see these heifers have lower skin temperatures throughout that pre-weaning phase. So cooling heifers is a win-win. Now, what about pre-weaned calves? Well, these calves are going to feel the heat too. And although there's this perception that they are less vulnerable to heat stress or more thermotolerant and better able to cope with, which in part is somewhat true, they are not typically offered heat abatement, primarily because we don't see these immediate or tangible effects on production like we see in cows. But they are susceptible to heat, and these hot and humid summers are going to be stressful for them as well, and are going to result in poor growth and health outcomes. And this is what I like to call my lab motto. Early life environment really matters, and it can have programming effects in that heifer that are going to impact them for a lifetime. Now, calves are always trying to thermoregulate to maintain their core body temperature within this narrow range. And if they are outside this thermoneutral zone, they are going to be shifting their energy away from other functions that are important, like growth, immune function, development, and things like that. And our research shows that temperature humidity index as low as 65, or even when you look at ambient temperature, as low as 20 degrees Celsius, which is about 68 Fahrenheit. These are enough to trigger changes in those pre-weaned animals, changes in thermoregulation, increase in respiration rates, increase in rectal temperature. When you look at respiration rate, every unit increase above THI of 65 or 69, whether it's in a continental or subtropical summer, respiration rate will increase by 2 or 2.5 breaths per minute. So we see even in temperate climates like Wisconsin, we see this substantial increases in thermoregulation, and this respiration rate starts much lower than what we're used to seeing in mature cows, like 60 breaths per minute. We're talking about 30 breaths per minute, 40 breaths per minute here that those animals start to increase due to their environment. Now, relieving some of that pressure of heat stress will depend on housing, and as you know, how calf housing can be very variable depending where you're at. In hatches, we can change the hatch material, we can add some extra shade, we can try to improve natural ventilation by shifting the hatch orientation, elevating the hatch, also adding extra rear windows, as you can see here, to promote that natural ventilation. When we're dealing with group housing, we tend to focus mostly on ventilation for obvious reasons, and not so much on cooling. We actually don't have any guidelines for airspeed recommendations to promote calf cooling in either in hatches or in group housing. And actually research on mechanical ventilation or even evaporative cooling in pre-weaned calves is very limited. There are just a handful of studies that are beginning to show the benefits of cooling calves in the pre-weaning period. So this is what we set up to do in the last, our focus in the last 4 or 5 years. Focus of my research, trying to bring those animals to thermoneutrality by implementing mechanical and evaporative cooling in different climates and in different housing types, as you can see here. So I'm going to walk you through some of the experiments we have done briefly before we can move on to the Q&A. So this is a study we did in Florida where we use active ventilations with fans in group house calves. So we had these barrel fans, and we have one oscillated fan above the ground. This fan was on 24/7, and we have this in a temperature schedule. And what we see here is that by providing these fans to group house pre-weaned calves, we were able to promote convective cooling, and we were able to reduce thermal indices, rectal temperature by 0.25 degrees Celsius, respiration rate by 15 breaths per minute, and skin temperature between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius lower when we offer those fans. And this was across the 24 hours of the day. We also see some changes, very interesting changes in behavior. When we provide these fans to pre-weaned heifers during summer, like I said, this was in Florida, very hot and humid. These calves drank more milk, and they drank throughout the day. So we were able to expand that throughout, even through the hottest time of the day. Whereas the calves that didn't have access to fans, they focused their drinking mostly early morning and later in the evening. And these fans allow them to drink the full allotment per visit, and they drank it faster. And they kept coming for more, so they weren't satiated. So we offer, I think in this project we offered 10 liters per day, and they kept coming for more. Also, we see some postural behaviors that are very interesting. These calves with access to fan were lying more in the center of the pen, seeking shade, and they were lying in this sternal tack position. And another interesting thing we see here is that the calves that didn't have access to fans were lying in this lateral position, trying to extend all the extremities to be able to exchange heat from presumably the cooler sand. So that was interesting to see. And another thing we see is that providing fans during this pre-weaning period decrease the treatment and medications of these calves, which is something to always keep in mind. Now, when we moved to Wisconsin, we start to see a lot more hutches as you drive down the road. So we had to get a little bit more creative on how to provide cooling to heifers. So we provide cooling in these sun-bedded hutches using solar energy from using these panels for solar energy. And what we did is we have these duct fans affixed to this tube, and that tube was redirecting the air inside the hutch, as you can see in that video, throughout this rear opening that we created. So by doing this, we increased their airspeed inside that hutch from almost negligent meters per second to 1.8 to 2.1 meters per second. We did this for a short period of time in 3-week-old heifers. And what we see is we were able to improve thermoregulation. They have lower sweating, lower respiration rate after we restrict them 30 minutes inside and outside that hutch to be able to measure these thermal indices. And we also see lower skin temperatures in the morning. But you live and you learn, and we observed that these fans were a little noisy. And sometimes those heifers spend a little bit more time outside that hutch, presumably because of that. So in this second project, what we did is we added a silencer here for those fans to be less noisy, and we bifurcated this tube to provide a little bit less air inside that hutch, because we felt that it was a little too much air in their face in that confined space. So here we reduced that a little bit. And we provide day and nighttime cooling. In the other study, we did only daytime cooling. And here we offer it for 4 weeks, the first 4 weeks of life, and then we turn it off until weaning. So what we see here is significant improvements in thermoregulation. Now what we did is we had 1 hour restriction inside, 1 hour restriction outside. We measure all the thermal indices, and we see reductions in skin temperature if those heifers had access to these fans, significant reductions, and also in rectal temperature. But I think one of the most important things that we see is a reduction in ammonia levels and colony forming units. What we did here is we sampled the air and we incubated overnight, and we counted the number of colony forming units. What we see is that having that air blowing through that hutch, it's improving the microclimate of inside the hutch. And also we see quite a few improvements in immune function of these heifers. So they are more able to phagocytize bacteria, and they express less pro-inflammatory cytokines and things like that. So improvements in thermoregulations, improvements in microclimate, so all good benefits for those outdoor hutches in summer in Wisconsin. Now, we wanted to move a step further, so we created this positive pressure tube ventilation system in collaboration with Carney Holbach from the Dairyland Initiative. And as part of one of our aims in our second USDA grant in collaboration with Dr. Shatau and also Adam Geiger, we had some other nutritional treatments here. But what we did here is we provided continuous airflow with daytime misters to calves that are housed outdoor in wire hutches. And we did this in a commercial farm in Florida. So you can see here we have this fan, and this is a drain tube about 100 meters in length. And we have these fans on 24/7, and misters were on only during the daytime. And if we look more closely, we have each heifer had access to 5 holes. These holes are 3.5 inches in diameter, and in the middle hole we had that daytime low pressure nozzle providing water. And so what we see here, this is the airspeed at different distances from the rear of the hutch, and what we can see is that on average we provide 1.8 meters per second at the center. This is the average airspeed, but even at 1.5 meters from the rear of the hutch, we still have 1 meter per second airspeed. So we were successful in providing airspeed for the entire hutch area, compared to heifers that did not have these tubes, these positive pressure ventilation tubes, and you can see that on average they have lower than 0.5 meters per second. I think it was 3.5. Now, interestingly, those daytime misters were able to reduce the hutch temperature area. As you can see in this graph, this is the temperature. We put these sensors that were measuring temperature and humidity, and what we achieve here is some nighttime cooling relief. So in this type of weather, it's hot even at night. So by adding these positive pressure tubes, we allowed that temperature that local temperature microenvironment to be reduced even at night. When it's very hot during the day, sometimes that difference is not showing, but I think it's very positive to see that at night these heifers are being cooled. This improves thermoregulations overall. It reduced skin temperature by 0.6 degrees Celsius, respiration frequency by 20 breaths per minute, as you can see in this graph. And it also reduced rectal temperature. We see this in a larger data set. We have 170 heifers in this study. And we also see, very interesting, you can see cameras here to observe behavior and activity. And we see that those heifers spend more time close to the air outlets. And this is not only during the day because they have more access to shade, but this is also observed during the night. So now we are kind of moving on to continue to investigate this positive pressure ventilation system now for indoor calves and in Wisconsin. So we're still working with the Dairyland Initiative to provide cooling to pre-weaned calves during the summer now in Wisconsin. So with this, please stay tuned. There's a lot more research coming, and so maybe for next webinar I can share that data with you. So to summarize and to finish this webinar, I want to offer some overall summary and some recommendations. In this first part of the talk, we focus mostly on the dry cow and the impact that she has on her daughter and granddaughter. So I think one important thing to remember is that heat stress effects go beyond just lactating cows, impacting those non-lactating dry cows. And the dry period is more than just a vacation for cows. There's this critical window for mammary gland development, both in the cow, that is prepping for her next lactation, but also on that calf, that early life mammary growth that starts even before she's born, and that plasticity that continues through the first months of life. And this impact really can extend beyond summer. It's not just about the summertime effect on lactating cows, but also the effects that span those summers due to these effects in 3 generations. Now, first gestation heifers are also vulnerable, as I showed you, and we can influence their first lactation milk and also her offspring. And pre-wean calves can also benefit from cooling. As I show you, there's a lot more work to do on how to do these effectively and translatable for use on farm. But there's a lot of promise here for cooling, to offering these early life thermoneutral conditions that they will grow and develop much better. So some recommendations: monitoring dry cows and young stock in summer and beyond because of those effects, and providing heat stress abatement when possible, especially when we focus on that early life development. We're allowing them to meet their full potential by doing so, and establishing long-term performance very early on, and maximizing these long-term generational effects when we're protecting that dry cow from heat stress as well. So I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank HORTS for showing our research in your journal. It's been a great pleasure to contribute to this research, so thank you for sharing. And last, I want to thank all our collaborators in the University of Florida, Georgia, the University of Wisconsin, all of which have contributed to some part of this data that I show. Grad students back in Florida and now in Wisconsin, undergraduate students and postdocs. So they are the ones doing all the work. So for that, I would love to thank them, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Laporta, for that presentation and sharing your insights on the impacts of heat stress on dairy cattle, not just lactating cows, but all the way along their entire lifespan. And I know you have a great team of students and other faculty members that you collaborate with. So thank you so much for sharing the research that all those individuals are working on so diligently. To our audience, if you'd like to view this webinar or any of our previous webinars, again, you can visit our archives at any time. You'll find those on our hordes.com webpage. Just visit the webinar tab, and there you'll see a list of all the previous webinars. We hope that you'll make plans to attend a future webinar. The first will take place on Monday, May 12th. Again, our webinars are always at noon Central Time. And we'll have Dr. Mike Hutchins, a friend of Hordes Dairyman. He's from the University of Illinois, and he'll be here to discuss high milk components and feeding cows to produce high milk components. In June, we'll have veterinarian Barb Peterson, who will be talking about maternity pen care for both cows and calves. So if either of those topics are interesting to you, please make plans to attend. We had a few questions that came in, so I will dive into those now. The first is, Dr. Laporta, do you know if there has been research done on other species besides dairy cattle? This person in particular was asking about goats, but any long-term impacts of heat stress on the production of other animals besides dairy cattle?
Yes, more familiar with Dr. Lance Baumgart studies in pigs, and also there's a few studies showing that in utero heat stress, they're able to do it at different times of gestation and showing effects, long-term effects of in utero heat stress on those piglets, and especially focusing on meat quality and finishing pigs. So there's definitely in productive animals, in pigs is where I'm more familiar with that data. Not so much in goats.
We had a few people ask a similar question, and this might be beyond your area of research, but they're wondering, they're complementing the in-depth study of how heat stress affects animals, especially during that late gestation period. Are there other stressors that could also have impacts on future production, such as nutrition, overcrowding, other stressors during that late gestation period?
Yeah, certainly. I think other than heat, I think what makes heat stress special in a way is that it impacts many aspects of that animal. I think the other one I can think of is nutrition, right? Like overnutrition and undernutrition can have metabolic effects that can span through generations as well. I think that's been shown in humans. When you think about other stressors such as overcrowding, I think those might come mostly through the effects on intake, I think, and cows that are more dominant, not letting other cows eat, and so having a less constant nutrient availability. I think that those might come off in that sense. But I don't think that those effects are going to be as chronic as the impact that heat stress might have on the cow and her developing offspring. I'm thinking mostly in late gestation. But I think one of the things that we have to think about is that all stressors are cumulative, right? So it's not about one or the other and one being more important. If you have dry cows that are overcrowded and heat stress, that certainly is going to lead to detrimental effects in their future production. So, and the generational effects as well.
What about the SLIC gene? Looking at some of the genetic ways to help manage heat stress. Any comments there?
Yep. So there's a lot of research being done in Puerto Rico, in Florida, looking at that possibility. I think it's a good one. I think anything we can do to improve thermoregulation of that cows under heat stress, it's going to be beneficial. I think I'm not reading that literature every day, so I'm not aware of the latest developments, but I think some of those cows are not as productive, the ones that have that SLIC gene. So what that's doing, that mutation, is generating cows with shorter hair, so they are better able to thermoregulate. But yes, I think, again, everything we can do to mitigate heat stress, it's welcome, absolutely.
That ties in pretty well to our next question. Is it better to provide some cooling for dry cows, even if it's limited? For instance, perhaps you have fans, but maybe you aren't able to add sprinklers, or you could add sprinklers for parts of the day. Is there a benefit to at least having some cow cooling?
Yes, 100%. I think that if you look at the earlier slide that I show in those heifers, first lactation, late gestation heifers, just the effect of shade is so powerful. Just reducing that solar radiation in cows it's the very first step to start overcoming the negative effects of heat stress. If you can add on fans, that's obviously even better. And it clearly depends on what climate you're at, right? In Florida, that probably will not cut it. You really need to soak those cows so that they can, you can promote that more of a evaporative cooling effect through the skin. And that's been shown to be probably the most effective way, especially when you are in these humid climates like Florida. But sometimes less humid climates, if you think of Arizona, for example, with misters, you can benefit as well. But it really depends on the intensity and the duration and what you have available infrastructure-wise, for sure. But shade is probably the most effective and simple way we can start, not only with calves, but also with cows and heifers as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that makes sense. And that is all we have for questions at this time. So thank you so much, Dr. Laporta, for answering the questions that came in, and thank you to our audience members for participating. I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Jimena Laporta from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we really appreciate the information you shared with our group today. I also want to thank all of our listeners for making time to join us. We really hope that you were able to take away some information that you can utilize on your dairy or with the dairy folks that you work with. Until next time, goodbye from our team here at Hordes Dairymen.